So, what is international trade? So, international trade is when, instead of just keeping goods and services within the economy, we also expand our production to the world, so places outside of our economy. So, if we look at the aggregate demand equation, it's all about exports and imports. So, we're looking at the production from outside the we're looking at the imports, so what we get from outside the economy, and we're looking at exports, so what people outside the economy buy from us. So this pretty much brings us to international competitiveness. So international competitiveness is about how, I guess, competitive we are in terms of producing certain goods or services. So for example, we trade with a lot of other countries and we're competitive, or we have an advantage in the areas that we are pretty much good at making. So international competitiveness, that's influenced by a comparative or competitive advantage. And that's pretty much the idea that some countries are better at producing certain goods and services at a lower cost or at a higher quality compared to other countries. So for example, Australia, where we have a great supply of coal, and we are great at producing livestock such as like beef, lamb, pork, all those things. So we actually have a comparative advantage in producing those goods and services. And also, we actually have a comparative advantage in producing camels, surprisingly. So we're actually one of the biggest biggest exporters of camels. Okay, so let's look at an example. So let's say Australia, we have a comparative advantage of producing beef. We can produce it at a very, very low price, but we're not so great at producing cars or technology. China, on the other hand, they can produce beef at a higher cost, but they can produce cars at the lowest cost. Whereas Singapore, they produce technology at the lowest cost. That gives us the opportunity to trade. So we trade beef for cars from China and technology from Singapore. So this allows us to produce what we're good at, and then we also trade to get resources, to get goods and services from other countries as well. So at the end of the day, we're trying to allocate resources across different countries in the most, I guess, efficient way. So we try to make sure that we're economies of scale. So what that means is we have greater productive efficiency. We're producing lots and lots of the same good or service so that we get really, really good at producing it. So the idea of trade is that we want an overall positive outcome. So overall, globally, we have an efficient allocation of resources. But we have some winners and we also have some losers in this area. So for exporters, they're winners. So they have a high demand for products, they have high demand for labor. Obviously, that means that there's more employment, more income, more better living standards. But for dying industries, so for industries that are trying to compete with much, much cheaper exports, people could potentially find jobs somewhere else, but they need to learn new skills. They might have lower incomes for that as well. Or people are not able to find jobs somewhere else and they'll be unemployed. So their skills are no longer demanded. So there are a combination of winners and losers, but people say that overall, if we can maintain our international competitiveness, then we can trade very well as well. This brings us to protectionism and liberalism. It's not that important for ECO, so I'll just cover it very, very briefly. Protectionism is when the government implements policies that sort of protect dying industries. So it's sort of like trade barriers, trade restrictions, tariffs on imports, and so on. Liberalization, so trade liberalization. So that's pretty much when the government reduces those barriers and promotes free trade. So trade without any barriers. Okay, so exchange rate. So this is something that's quite important. So exchange rate can influence things outside of trade. So exchange rate is the value of the Australian dollar in terms of another foreign currency. So it should probably say foreign currency. Usually exchange rate is measured in terms of the US dollar, and it's just a matter of convention, but so it's not like it has to be like that. You can measure it against many different currencies. So I checked this quite recently. So the exchange rate on 18th of March was about, so $1 gives you about 66 US cents. US is not the only country that we care about though. So we do a lot of our trade with China. So we do care a lot about the Chinese currency. We care a lot about Japanese currency as well because we also trade quite a lot with them. So this brings me to the trade weighted index, which is basically the weighted basket of currencies of Australia's trading partners. So if Australia trades a lot with a certain country, then it has more weighting on that country's currency. If there's less trade with a certain country, then there's less weighting on their currency. Okay, so a little bit about trade itself. So the values are dependent on the Forex currency market. So again, you don't need to go too much in depth for this, but all you need to know is it depends on the demand for our currency again. So if there is a lot of demand for Australian currency, then the AUD will appreciate. If there is too much supply and not so much demand, and then the AUD will depreciate. So this should actually say depreciate here. So there's a bit of a mistake in the second part. So AUD will depreciate if the supply of the Australian currency increases. This, again, not a huge part of ECO, floating and fixed exchange rate. We don't really need to worry about the dirty float either because it's not like a huge aspect of 3-4 ECO, not really going to be tested on it. But we have a floating exchange rate. So that pretty much means that over time, depending on the demand and supply of AUD, that influences the value of the Australian dollar. But the RBA, so Reserve Bank of Australia, sometimes does intervene to sort of do a dirty float. So that basically means that they sort of intervene to, influence the level of, influence the value of the Australian dollar. So that can also sometimes happen. Trade, so again, balance of payments, that's a big part of trade, and you're going to cover a lot of it in next term. It can be quite tricky, so a lot of people do find this is one of the harder concepts to get their head around. But a few things to keep in mind. So when we trade, we have a number of transactions that we go through, and they all fall in different categories. So we've got aspects that fall in the current account and the capital and financial account. And what we say is the current account and capital and financial account, they sort of balance each other out. Okay, current account, that's like that's stuff that we spend currently. So when we buy exports, that's recorded in the current account. So it's a current payment. It has no future obligations. It's just a once-off payment. Capital and financial account have future obligations. So I'll talk about that a little bit later on. But the main thing I want you to keep in mind is current account, capital and financial account balance each other. So if the current account is positive, the CAFA or capital and financial account is negative, But if the current account is negative, then the CAFA is positive. So when you add both of them together, they should be equal to 0. Current account is usually understood a little bit better, and it's made up of 4 different things. So we've got net goods, which is pretty much exports and imported. So if we have a credit, it means money coming to Australia. If we have a debit, money coming out of Australia. Next is our net services. So every time we export a service, so this is stuff like tourism, education, that's a credit. Every time we import a service, so every time people in Australia go overseas for education, go overseas for tourism, that's a debit. We've got primary incomes, so that's pretty much when we have income that Australian businesses or investments, they earn overseas, that's a credit. And then income from foreign businesses that are made in Australia, that's a debit. Secondary income's usually just gifts, so they're sort of not really exchanged for anything. It's sort of like a gift. So if you decide that you want to transfer some money to a cousin overseas, that's going to be recorded as a debit in the secondary income. Okay, so when we add up all the credits and subtract all the debits, we pretty much get the balance. So if we have a positive balance, that's a surplus. So that's more credits than debits. If we have a negative balance, that's a deficit, so more debits than credits. And then obviously we have lots and lots of money that we're dealing with, so very, very difficult to have a perfectly balanced account. But perfectly balanced is credits equal to debits, so it's sort of like 0. Australia's current account, almost always in deficit. We've really rarely seen it in a surplus. Capital account, so that's another part of trade. So capital account refers to the capital transfers. So this is like transfer of assets when someone moves in or out of Australia, and also just non-financial or non-produced assets as well. So capital account is not a big part. We only really focus on the current account. Financial account, again, not really a big part of it. The 2 things that you really need to know is net portfolio investment. So that's pretty much when you invest in less than 10% of a company. And then there's net direct investment. So if you invest in more than 10% of a company, or if you just start a whole new business overseas, that would be net direct investment. So those are the main things. The CAFA is not really talked about that much, and it's also not really tested on that much. The very main thing you need to know is how the current account and CAFA are related and the different parts of the current account. Balance of payments, so like I said before, balance of the CAFA and the current account are in balance. So if one is positive, the other is negative, they add up to 0. Again, you don't need to know why. Usually there are small errors because obviously we have huge amounts of money that are being recorded. We look at the net foreign liabilities. So that's pretty much what we owe to all the other nations in the world. So net foreign liabilities is net foreign debt plus net foreign equity. So we'll talk about what those are in a bit, so don't stress too much. So net foreign liability, so if net foreign liability is positive, it means that we owe money to the rest of the world. So this is where it gets a little bit confusing. So if we have a positive value in our liability, it means we have liabilities and we owe money. If net foreign liabilities is negative, it means that the rest of the world owes us money. So usually we have more liabilities because we owe more money than other countries owe us, and that's because we have a lot of net foreign debt. Again, what is net foreign debt? Is how much we borrow minus how much we lend. We borrow a lot more than we lend, so obviously we're going to have a lot of debt. And before you think about where the debt comes from, it actually doesn't really come from government. There's actually a lot of debt that comes from the private sector, so households that borrow. So terms of trade, that's pretty much an index, and it represents the ratio between the prices that we get for our exports and the prices we pay for our imports. So terms of trade is quite important in ECO, and it's basically it's basically calculated using the price index. So export price index and import price index. Again, it sort of tells us how many imports we can get for every export we sell. So it's all about prices. It's not about value anymore. It's about the prices of our exports and prices of our imports and comparing them. So we're not going to cover the factors that change the terms of trade because obviously there's a lot of things that affect the prices of our imports versus exports, and that is definitely something that you will cover next term.